everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Dana.
And it's Jackie from my house.
I know. We're sort of in the midst of historical events and recording separately still. So hopefully the sound will be okay. We've been very fortunate. Our editor, Dan, has been doing a great job helping keep these things together, which is great because it's so many like online webcams and head mics. It's a crazy time for audio recording podcasts, I guess. Or maybe it's not. Maybe most people record this way, I guess. We're used to doing it together, so it's a little weird.
I do love the memes that are out there. It's like, for the love of God, if you're a 35-year-old man, do not start your own podcast.
Yeah. I know.
I say go for it. We all need more podcasts in our life.
Got to do something, at nighttime when you're lonely and you want to talk at people. So anyway, this is not a podcast about audio engineering through distance, or is it about whether you should or should not start your own podcast? This is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic in the field and discuss some relevant research articles related to that topic. This week is no different. We are talking about the very interesting topic, resurgence. What? Who put this on the list? Resurgence? That's
Kay did. Listener Kay. Listener Kay reached out to us and said, "Dear ABA Inside Track, I really would like to know more about resurgence." And we said, "Okay." I'm so funny.
I think we said nobody else wants to know about resurgence, so we're not going to. No. We do. Let this be a testament to the fact we do take episode suggestions from listeners, even if this is probably one that a lot of people will see in their podcast feed and go, "What? I don't want to talk about that. I'm not going to listen to that." So don't delete it, though. As much as I tease, I'm starting off this episode with some background information because this is a topic that I myself had very little knowledge of, other than sort of like the very basic sense of what it was, not even the principles. I knew the definition. I kind of could like give a metaphorical view of maybe what it was, and that was it. And not only did I read some of the articles that Jackie picked out for this week, some good relevant ones, but I also read one that Jackie accidentally told me to read, all about quantitative models of resurgence, which, wow.
Yeah, so as background information, that would be a great one. It's by Brian Greer and Timothy Shanahan. It was in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. It's about resurgence and all of the different ways that linear models can look at resurgence, but it's heavy. It's like a big cream pie. Are those heavy?
I mean, they got a lot of cream in them, so I would assume that there's a level of weight, yeah.
Like a custard, is that what you're thinking?
A flan.
Yes,
You're thinking of a flan. That seems really heavy, right?
And I do love that one as background information, but it is so lengthy that it might be difficult to cover in a full length 1 hour show.
Not only is it lengthy, but if you sort of get it, it's lengthy. You're like, oh, what am I reading? And usually when you get those big papers, you look through and you're like, maybe they did the thing where they have like 2 pages or just graphs. That's it. Like they took up that. So that's not as long. But when you're looking through it, you're going to notice, oh man, there are equations. It's like V alt equals V alt over 1. That's the wrong one. And K, well, what's K? Well, that's the asymptote. And you're skimming through it. You're gonna put that article down. I think most people are gonna say, nope. You know what? I'm not reading this. I'm out of high school math. I don't need to find the limit under the curve. I'm not doing it. But I will start us off, and I will say for a topic that I was dreading, and I won't be talking as much as on some other episodes because this is more the realm of the 2 doctors on the show discussing resurgence. I found this to be a very understandable topic, even when discussed in terms of the quantitative model of resurgence as choice behavior. When I read the wrong article there, I found it to be very understandable. So if you like the articles that we discuss on this episode, hey, you know what? You're right. Like Jackie said, get the Greer, get the Shahan article, 2019 in Java, and, really go for it. And you be the smartest BCBA on the block. At least you'll feel like you are reading that one.
And the prettiest.
And maybe the prettiest. I can't say. I can't see you. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think people who understand resurgence's choice graphs, they're beautiful people. they're fabulous. So that's enough about the intro to the intro. Let's talk about the articles we will be discussing today. So Jackie, do you mind doing the honors?
Sure. Yeah. So the first article that we'll talk about today will be by Volkart, Lerman, Kahl, Trosclair and Lazar in 2009, and that is titled An Evaluation of Resurgence During Treatment with Functional Communication Training, and that is the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. We will also be talking about Bloom and Lambert, 2015, Implications for Practice, Resurgence and Differential Reinforcement of Alternative Responding, and that also is in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. And then we'll take it on home with Lambert, Bloom, Samaha, Dayton, and Rodewald in 2015. And that one is called Serial Alternative Response Training as Intervention for Target Response Resurgence. And that also is the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. I don't think I've ever done the titles.
You must have done it at least once.
I don't know. In the 4 years, I don't think so. Usually Diana gets the honor because she's better at last names.
I do love reading the titles.
I'm feeling really blessed right now.
Hashtag blessed.
This is our new digital lives where I need to have them in front of me to read them effectively. And since I already had the wrong one, it sort of threw me for a loop. So they're online, so we got them there. But if I don't have them in front of me, I get a little stage fright. I need the physical copies, and that's hard these days. Why don't we get into the topic of resurgence? So I'll do a little brief preamble. Again, not because I know the most about this at all, as you will see, but because as the least doctorish of us all, for a topic that I think sounds like the realm of academics, even you too, the person who doesn't have a PhD, you too can learn about resurgence and talk mildly intelligently about it.
So many of you listeners out there will be familiar with the concept of extinction, but I want to present it to you first to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? So extinction is no longer providing a reinforcer for a response that was previously reinforced. I had to stop myself because I almost used what I learned back in undergrad school not to do, which is to define something by saying is when. Extinction is when, blah, 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 blah. So this is a side note to the pre-intro. My dear, now late psychology professor, Dr. Charles Brewer, taught us in class to not say is when. And if you wrote on your paper, if you defined something as in is when, he would take a big red marker and start at the is when and draw a spiral, spiraling out from the is when all over your entire paper. And when he passed them back, everyone in class would see if you got an is when spiral.
Wow.
So I had to stop myself there for a second, so I didn't use it. So
what do you say? Because I think I say is
well,
when
you need
sometimes.
to reframe your whole sentence in a different way so that you're not, starting it out differently. Right. So that's what extinction is, right? And I usually describe it to my students as you're breaking the response reinforcer relation such that the response can continue to occur, but the chance of that response being followed by what was previously the reinforcer is now 0%. So it's not blocking the response, but it's breaking the response reinforcer relation. So that response is never going to be reinforced again. When that happens, over time, you'll see that behavior decrease, and that process is extinction. So when
right, not quick.
It's not quick, exactly. So when extinction occurs, there are a few things that can and not always, but sometimes do happen. So the first would be an extinction burst, where you see an increase in responding immediately upon implementation of extinction. You might also see, sometimes but not always, other types of extinction-induced novel behavior occur, as well as extinction-induced aggression that might occur. And then, after the response extinguishes and is now occurring at low levels, you could also see what's called spontaneous recovery. In spontaneous recovery, the response has previously been extinguished, all of a sudden pops back up, and you might see
like, hey
wait, here I am, I'm back. Might see responding occur a little bit again, not necessarily at previous levels, but higher than 0, and the response is not reinforced in those instances either, and it generally quickly drops back out of the repertoire again. Okay, so you could have an extinction burst right after extinction. You could have spontaneous recovery, which occurs after the response is extinguished, or in certain circumstances, you could have resurgence. So resurgence is different than both extinction burst or spontaneous recovery, but it is the reoccurrence of behavior that was previously extinguished, but under a certain set of conditions. And that is why I am naming this episode Resurgence, a Tale of Two Behaviors.
Oh, I love it, because it is two behaviors.
All right. So that being said, Rob wants to talk about resurgence intro. So that was the pre-intro. Now we're ready for the real intro. Take it away.
Okay. I mean, there's not much more to add, I guess. So really, when we're talking about resurgence, what we're talking about here, which I think is an area that I always was confused in, was that you see the previously reinforced behavior spontaneously reoccurring when some alternative or other behavior is placed on extinction. The interesting part is the fact that, well, it's resurgence because that previously extinguished behavior is not now being reinforced again. There's no additional reinforcement. It's like, no, and it's like a vacuum, so you have your target behavior you're starting with, maybe it's like aggression, and it's being reinforced. We know this is basic behavior. Let's teach the alternative response, FCT perhaps. So you're gonna reinforce a new response. So what do you expect to see? Well, that kid saying, excuse me, or I want blank statement, whatever the alternative behavior, you're gonna see that occur more frequently because now that is being reinforced. The target behavior, that aggression, SIB, whatever it is, no longer being reinforced. It's on extinction. And then the interesting thing with resurgence is you get to that last part where, well, what if all of a sudden I stopped responding to the FCT? So I put the FCT on extinction. So now everything's on extinction. There's no reinforcement anywhere, it seems like, for the interest of the discussion. And without any of that reinforcement, that original target behavior starts happening again. It starts occurring again. And that's really where the interesting part of resurgence of like, where the hell did that come from? No one's reinforcing it. Because I think I used to think of resurgence as like, well, of course, if you stop reinforcing the new alternative behavior, you're going to go back and start, reinforcing the original inappropriate or target behavior. So of course you'll see it again, but that's not what we're talking about. There's no reinforcement, yet there's still the occurrence of an old target behavior, which I thought that was gone. I thought that was out of the repertoire. Nope, it's still there. It just kind of seems to magically reoccur. Now, I could get into quantitative models as to why it might magically reoccur, but I won't do that. That's a little beyond, nor do I think I'm qualified or prepared to talk about that. But hey, I could kind of do it. I could fake it, I think. So, the way you would usually see resurgence is in a situation where, again, you have your target behavior and then you teach the alternative behavior. And then over time, in reality, as much as we'd love to say, and now everyone uses the alternative behavior, they reinforce the alternative behavior by providing reinforcement for it every time it occurs. We all know that over time there's procedural drift, or people say, I haven't seen that aggression in months. I probably don't have to respond to the alternative behavior anymore, or I can even just thin the reinforcement just a little bit or just a lot of it, whatever it might be. And that's typically where you'll see resurgence. All of a sudden, whoa, aggression's back. But I'm not giving him a toy for aggression. I'm not giving attention for aggression or delivering attention following aggression anymore. It doesn't matter. You still get that pattern of boom, old target behavior's back. Again, if it stays on extinction, it will eventually, go back to, close to zero rates of responding again. But it's so odd that without any reinforcement, additional reinforcement, behavior would occur. Because we always think of, well, when does behavior occur? When it's reinforced. And, well, there's no reinforcement. Where did it come from? It's like a ghost.
Well, that's actually a good thing to think about, though, because most of the time when behavior resurges, it's part of the same response class, right, as that FCT. So you might not be reinforcing the problem behavior, but at one point you've reinforced some behavior as part of that larger response class, which is kind of like weird to think about. I always am like response class, but it makes sense.
I think the most interesting part of the quantitative models, I should say, were looking at the idea of reinforcement as having this history, and they're sort of graphing almost like the echo of reinforcement in the past, to use kind of a metaphor to describe a very technical article. And I found that to be very fascinating because I think we talk about the idea of learning history, but when you look at sort of the graph of what the learning history might be like and what's the value of the reinforcer from sessions ago, and it still lingers in the air kind of, again, I'm doing a bad job describing mathematical models, but I'm going to use some metaphors because it's fun. It's fun sometimes.
Yeah.
So one thing that I felt really helped with the Volcker article, and I think really is helpful when you're trying to get into some of the resurgence in terms of understanding of where it comes from, was looking at a lot of the original non-human studies on resurgence and sort of thinking about these three phases that you're going to see in resurgence. So you've got your phase one, which is sort of, here's where we are, here's the target behavior. We have, in real life, we're usually talking about some sort of a problem behavior. So we're seeing some target behavior, it's being reinforced at whatever rate it's being reinforced before we do any sort of an intervention. That's phase one. So you will see a lot of target behavior because it's being reinforced. You'll see no alternative behavior because it's not being reinforced. That makes sense, right? Then when we think of our FCT kind of treatment in the labs, it would be with pigeons, you'd reinforce some other response like key pecking to spinning, whatever it might be. Now you're talking about, well, now I'm going to reinforce the alternative behavior. So applied behavior, we'd be talking about probably like your FCT. and you reinforce the alternative behavior and you put the target behavior on extinction. So of course, what are the patterns you're going to see? Lots and lots of alternative behavior, almost no or no target behavior because one behavior is reinforced, one behavior is on extinction. There you go. Now, the reality of life is we're probably not going to get to stay in phase 2 forever, which is what we'd really like. We're probably going to go to some amalgamation of a phase 3 where everything is being put on extinction, both the target and the alternative behavior. So again, if you were asked someone who wasn't aware of resurgence or didn't understand resurgence, what's going to happen? They'd probably say, well, you won't see any alternative behavior and you won't see any target behavior. But in many cases, they'd be wrong because, yes, you wouldn't see any alternative behavior. It's no longer being reinforced, but you might see that target behavior again. And that's sort of phase 3 of resurgence. I found when I thought of resurgence in terms of those 3 phases, especially because the articles kept referring to phase 1, 2, 3, like they kept referring back to the animal studies, it made narrative sense to me, especially we're getting into the more in-depth stuff. So maybe that'll help you, maybe it won't. But that's the basics of what I learned about resurgence. And now I'm going to let you guys take the rest of the show to talk about the really smart stuff about resurgence. But it can be learned by anyone. If I can learn it, you can learn it too.
Yeah. And I think what the articles that we've chosen are going to be really practical for clinicians, right? So if you are looking to think about what your FCT is doing, what your DRA is doing, that's why we've chosen these articles to kind of give you an overview of how you need to set up your treatment programming so that you could potentially avoid resurgence or, I love one of the words in my articles, inoculate against resurgence. But yeah, so I think these are really practical, like no nonsense articles.
Okay. Well, now that we've used the podcast to practice my verbal fluency on a new topic, it's like I'm back in grad school all over again. Let's move into the Volkert article. So Diana, please enlighten us with all your knowledge.
Alrighty, so I'm going to review the Volkert and colleagues article from 2009 for you, which is really looking at how a resurgence model fits into functional communication training. Because generally, the way functional communication training works is you have a problem behavior that you determine through assessment is occurring to produce some particular function. You want to put that behavior on extinction in conjunction with training an appropriate alternative response and keep that behavior on extinction once that response is acquired. However, as Rob was describing, this can sometimes happen. You either no longer reinforce the new functional communication response, such as, can I have a toy, please? Or excuse me, please? Or I need a break, please, right? It either no longer produces the reinforcer through a variety of things that happen in life, right? Or, and this is important too, sometimes that schedule of reinforcement can be thinned quite low, such that for the individual, it really may function quite similarly to extinction, right? So if you're only reinforcing it on a very thin schedule, then that can look and feel a lot like extinction. And there's some animal model research to demonstrate the behavioral outcomes of that as well. So they wanted to use that model specifically related to functional communication training and go through those 3 phases that Rob described in a really practical way for individuals who both had problem behavior that needed to be reduced and who needed to learn some functional communication skills. So they had 5 participants in this study. All of them had a diagnosis of autism or another developmental disorder. They were aged 5 to 9 and engaged in a variety of problem behavior. So Ben was 9. He engaged in self-injury, aggression, and disruption. Bella was 8. She engaged in self-injury and aggression. Sam and Max were both 5. They engaged in aggression and disruption. And Connor was 5 and engaged in aggression. And then they note that Ben and Bella also had visual impairment as well. And they were looking at 2 types of behavior that they were taking data on. One was behavior to decrease, which include a bevy of different types of challenging behavior, including both aggression and self-injury. And they described them and they were quite serious behaviors to decrease. And then they had an alternative response that they were going to teach in its place that was based upon functional analysis data, and the topography was determined dependent on the child and their abilities. So for Ben, they had him pass a card. For Bella and Max, they taught them a sign. And for Connor and Sam, they had a vocal response. So there were 3 parts to this study. The first was that they did a functional analysis. I wrote in my notes a good old functional analysis, meaning it was like a standard Iwata FA. And they got some pretty clear results for all of their participants. So for Ben, they found that his behavior was likely maintained by escape. For Bella, her initial FA was largely undifferentiated with low levels of responding, but they did an extension and found that her behavior was mostly maintained by escape from walking or taking walks or transitioning. So they had to make a modification there, but then they saw the behavior occur under those conditions. Sam's behavior occurred under both tangible and attention conditions. Max's behavior appeared to be escape maintained, and Connor's was both access to tangibles and escape. So once they had that out of the way, they were able to identify likely function of the behavior, and then they identified what was going to be a good functional communication response to train for each of these participants. And then they were broken up into two different studies. One wanted to evaluate the resurgence paradigm under straight up extinction, right? Kind of like we described. And their second study was where they wanted to evaluate the intermittent reinforcement idea to see, did you see resurgence under those conditions? So they had one participant that did both, which is kind of interesting, but
they were bored that day. They just needed something to do.
Ben did both. So I know, it's kind of interesting. But Ben, Bella, and Sam were in experiment 1. And this was arranged like an ABC reversal design, meaning they had 3 conditions and they did each of those conditions twice. So the A condition was a baseline that was identical to the FA, meaning the aggression or self-injury was reinforced under the maintaining variables condition. And then in condition B, they had a functional communication training phase and then a maintenance phase of that functional communication response. So they taught the response and then they placed the problem behavior on extinction. So they initially went through and set up the responding for the functional communication response on an FR1. Responding was occurring at high levels. And once that happened, then they looked to make sure that the behavior was maintained. And they had really specific criteria for maintenance of the response, which I just appreciated. So they had to exhibit the functional communication response in at least 50% of the rate of problem behavior in the last 3 sessions of baseline. So they wanted to make sure, were they accessing this response or using this response to access basically at least half the same level of reinforcement that they were in baseline, right? To ensure that it was likely really functioning in the same way. And in order for it to be considered in maintenance, they had to have an 80% reduction of problem behavior compared to their last 3 sessions of baseline. And I liked that because it wasn't just and then we taught it and it seemed good and we moved on, right? They were really clear in how they were going to define that behavior was maintained. So I just liked that a lot. And they made sure that the maintenance condition lasted for 10 sessions and they had to maintain those criteria for that length of time. And then once that happened, then they went into the extinction phase. And it was extinction in the sense that the problem behavior was still under extinction as it had been in the FCT phase. But now the functional communication response that they had just trained was also under extinction. So neither one produced access to the reinforcer.
Kids are mad. Kids are
Yes,
mad.
exactly. So you would expect to see a lot of behavior occurring, right? And they measured to see if the behavior that occurred continued to be the newly trained functional communication response or the previously extinguished problem behavior. That's what they wanted to see. They were all 10-minute sessions. And the test for resurgence, they considered it to be resurgence if they saw the problem behavior occur at a rate that exceeded the rate of the problem behavior in the functional communication training maintenance phase. Okay, so it didn't need to be as high as it was initially in baseline, but even if they saw a little blip, they were that looks like resurgence to us because it was higher than the rates that they saw under the previous condition.
And you wouldn't expect to see it be higher than in baseline for resurgence, at least in the animal studies that have been done before this sort of extension to humans. That was never the pattern they saw.
No, and keep in mind too, like you said, it's not reinforced, right? So even when you do see resurgence occur, it's not being met with reinforcement. So you wouldn't expect to see it hopefully continue, but if it occurred at all, then that's what it counted as. Okay, so in study 1, the participants learned the functional communication response. So that was good. They did know that it took Ben a little while, and they thought his behavior was escape maintained. They thought that maybe the demands that they were using were really not setting up the EO in the way that they thought it would. So that they needed to change tasks, and then they saw more responding. occur, and all participants showed at least some resurgence according to their criteria in that C phase, in the extinction phase, both when they initially went through the sequence and then when they did it again. So then so they said, okay, yep, we totally see resurgence under these conditions. It's different, but it's clinically applicable, right? So it's important to be able to think about behavior in this way. But how often do we fully put functional communication responding on extinction? Hopefully not that much. But what can end up happening is that we thin the schedule, right? Maybe we thin it too fast or it's inadvertently thinned. And this can operate very much like extinction. So this is a really clinically applicable situation. What if we start to see behavior reemerge because it's a very thin intermittent schedule of reinforcement? So that's what they set up for study 2. Ben was back. He did it again. They said they retaught the response to make sure it was solid. Maybe some time had passed in between the two. So Ben was back. Max and Connor participated here. And this was set up pretty much the same way. It was the ABC again. Baseline was the same. FCT was the same. However, instead of the C condition was now not extinction, but intermittent reinforcement, which they called a modified resurgence test. And the response was reinforced on FR12 instead. So the functional communication response was reinforced only every 12th time that it occurred. They checked to see if they saw a resurgence occur under the same conditions. So what we saw here is that everyone learned the functional communication response or relearned it again. And they saw very similar results. They saw problem behavior resurge in the intermittent reinforcement condition, just like it had in the previous study in the extinction condition. They did continue to see the functional communication response occurring as well, but at lower levels than it had been in just the regular condition. So that was a little bit different, but they still saw the problem behavior occur at levels that they considered to be resurgence, even under the intermittent reinforcement condition. So that's pretty noteworthy, right? Because I think that sometimes you say, I don't know why that happened. I don't know where that behavior came from. It just cropped back up out of nowhere, right? He can still ask for a break. He can still, do. But if that schedule of reinforcement is perhaps too thin, then you might see resurgence occur even under conditions that you aren't expecting to see it occur. So I thought that was really important. They did list a couple limitations that we should point out, but this was a really cool and well done study. So they're like, these are good to note, but I have no qualms here. They note that the first response was put on extinction while the functional communication response was being trained, and that's different than the animal literature. But this is pretty common in functional communication training, right? Like this is kind of how things typically occur. We wouldn't put a response on extinction without teaching the appropriate alternative response. So it's like, okay, I guess it's a limitation, but like that's what makes this clinically applicable is that you tested it under these conditions. They also note that the intermittent FR12 schedule they chose was arbitrarily chosen, and it might have been more realistic to thin the schedule over time. I do agree with them there, because that is typically what you would see is to start with an FR1 and then slowly move to a thin schedule. They only had 10 sessions to test for resurgence. Okay, that is what they did. And they noted that everyone here had a similar diagnosis, so they didn't know how other individuals who might carry a different diagnosis, like ADHD, for example, might respond, if it would be similar or not. So that would bear replication for additional populations. And the other thing that maybe is good to point out is that they ended on the resurgence condition, right? Meaning that the problem behavior was now occurring at higher levels than it had been occurring under the most optimal conditions previously in the study. So that was good to point out. Hopefully, after they stopped recording data for the study, they did re-implement the FCT in a way that was most beneficial for the participants. And then they have a great discussion that goes through talking about resurgence versus extinction-induced variability and spontaneous recovery and how all of those may be related, etc. But this was one of the first studies that had applied the concept of resurgence to this population and specifically looking at escape maintain behavior. So, there's plenty more work to be done in this area. So I don't think that they should knock themselves in that way. This was an awesome study.
But they are so good at telling, this is an amazing study to hear all of our limitations. It's like, give yourself a break, guys.
Right.
You're doing it.
It's all reviewer 2, man.
That's all reviewer 2. Reviewer 2 is like, let me knock them down. Here are all the limitations you need to put in.
All right. Well, thank you, Diana. Why don't we take a little break? And then when we come back, we will continue our discussion of Resurgence. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking all about Resurgence. Yes, it's coming back.
Is that a joke?
What?
That we're back talking all about Resurgence?
No. Well, I was trying to think of a better one than that one, but that was kind of the other one. I was like, it's mildly, punny? No, not exactly.
You tried to extinguish us, but we're back.
Yeah. There's no way we would know because we're recording to each other. All right. So before we get back to our discussion on Resurgence, I wanted to remind our listeners or let new listeners know ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you are able to earn 1 learning credit. Ooh, how exciting. All you need to do is listen to the full episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUS, get CEUs, and you need to put in your information, as well as 2 secret code words we've hidden in the episode. I'm going to give you the first one now. It is Pterodactyl. Pterodactyl. You want to do that one more time for us, Diana?
Pterodactyl. Pterodactyl.
It's a prehistoric bird from, I believe, the Cretaceous period who flew. You know, you've seen them all over. They've got the weird beak, and then they fly all over the place.
Did they have feathers?
No, no, that's Archaeopteryx.
Oh, okay, fine.
Which is our other secret code. No, I'm kidding. That's
JK.
We're just doing dinosaurs, the Pliocene era. No, pterodactyl. And again, if you spell it wrong and do like terra, like the ground, T-E-R-A, honestly, we don't care too much. We'll know you listen. You didn't just pick
I get all variations of all words.
Yeah, you didn't pick that one out of the air. If you put something like pterodactyl. Pterodactyl. Whew. Okay. Let's move on back to Resurgence. Now that we talked about that for a while, I'm sure everyone's excited to hear about Resurgence again. So, Jackie, you have 2 articles here. One kind of brief, one a little bit longer that goes more into the application of our knowledge of Resurgence and how that can affect our treatments.
Yeah, and so I'm going to kind of mesh these 2 articles together because they are meshed already. So I will begin by talking about Bloom and Lambert in 2015. But then during this talk, I will zoom over to Lambert and colleagues in 2015 because it's discussed in the article, and I think it deserves its own merit. So just giving a shout out to our buddy Joe Lambert. Hey, Joe Lambert. So Resurgence, I think this implications for practice article is so necessary for clinicians to read because all of us use differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, I'm pretty sure, in our lives, right, during our everyday clinical practice. And I think this concept of Resurgence is really helpful to consider when using a DRA procedure because we know that DRAs must be implemented with high treatment integrity. And this is not always the case, unfortunately, right? So if you're thinking about a DRA and you're thinking about where the DRA will, be implemented in school, at home, with babysitters, with grandparents, if it's not implemented with high treatment integrity, you may see some resurgence in problem behavior. And this could be really unfortunate for you as a clinician to gain buy in and have confidence over behavior analytic procedures, right? Because DRA is very common. So they give the example that a staff learns to implement FCR and problem behavior extinguished, but for some reason the FCR is not reinforced, and thus problem behavior may be reemitted due to that resurgence. And then educators, when they see this resurgence of problem behavior, may then say, oh, this doesn't work. Like, why are they making me do this? Like, and then they may lose confidence in the behavioral analytic principles altogether. It's also really common in real life, right? It's not always possible to honor and reinforce an FCR. They were like in my head when I was reading this article, because they're like, you can't always reinforce 1 more minute when you're trying to get in the car, or I want a break where you're eating dinner. I'm like, hell yes.
Oh, and a lot of times when I'm working with individuals and I'm trying to sort of promote the idea of like, oh, well, this is how we're going to start. It's very quick to be like, well, where do we stop? And, you want to be like, oh, like 2 sessions, 10 trials each. And then you're fine. It's like, I can't promise when you can stop. Maybe you can't stop. And the other problem and the realistic problem of like, yeah, but what if, that I can't tell them they can have that because it's not available all of a sudden. And it's like, well, you can't plan for that. So, but you can either plan for it by trying to teach something new and then like hoping for the best when it happens and then planning to fade as quickly as you're able, or you could do nothing and you'll still be in that same terrible situation you're describing to me, but you don't even have an alternative. But that is a real question that comes up when you're talking about these treatments. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you're also thinking about a DRA, not everybody in the world of your child or your client knows how to reinforce or what to reinforce, right? So they may take that appropriate behavior for granted, which is in the case of like babysitters or grandparents or people unfamiliar with a treatment plan. So it could be at that one moment that, that alternative behavior is not reinforced, problem behavior may reemerge, and then it may contact reinforcement. And if it does, it's likely to continue and ruin everything that you just did, right? Which would really suck for you as a clinician and for the client. And this really may sway the confidence in behavioral analytic approaches if the problem behavior comes back at full force. If this does happen, which unfortunately I have seen in some, educational settings, that may lead to, getting rid of all behavior analytic approaches altogether. Like, oh, that didn't work for this. We're going to try something else. And usually that something else is a more restrictive procedure, right? So it could lead to punishment procedures, restraints, leaning on non-behavioral analytic approaches altogether. And that's like kind of a bummer, right, for us, because we know that our treatments can work if implemented with high fidelity. So I think this is a nice thing to think about resurgence and maybe plan for it. And let people know that this could happen. Because I don't think ever in my life have I said like, oh, just so you know, we're going to do this procedure and this problem behavior may come back, right? Because you don't say that because you want people to be like, okay, we're doing it. And I think that might be helpful to tell people like, I think this is when it would come back and this is how we're going to do things to resolve it, right? And so they do say here that in this article that appropriate behavior can resurge as well if placed on extinction. Right. So if it's a previously extinguished response, you may not always just see the problem behavior reemerge. You may also see other behaviors that are part of that larger response class reemerge. And that's where the Lambert et al. 2015 study comes into play. So now I'm zooming in to there is what they wanted to look at is when could you, I love the word, I've been using it all day, inoculate against resurgence, right? And so we know why resurgence occurs. We know that it could be due to a history of reinforcement, densities of reinforcement, multiple exposures to extinction, right? All those things can affect resurgence, but little research has been done on the order and magnitude in which behaviors will resurge. So will a behavior that was more recently taught or put on extinction, will that come up first in the response class or will something else come up? And so they wanted to look at if clinicians can teach multiple responses, multiple appropriate responses, well, then that mitigate the effects of resurgence of the target behavior.
It is clever.
Which I think is clever.
I mean, it makes sense. Like you said, Jackie, well, if we're talking about resurgence of problem behavior, well, why couldn't any behavior resurge? There's plenty of things that I know I've done in my life that I think it's great. And that's been put on extinction. And then I've had an alternative behavior, which then got put on extinction. It's kind of like falling back on your old patterns. Any behavior should be able to occur in resurgence. So yeah, why not take advantage of that, possibility occurring?
Oh yeah. So this could help too with the idea that problem behavior will resurge during treatment infidelity, and maybe we can mitigate those effects. So plan for the treatment not to be run as planned, which it usually is not.
Yeah.
I like that. Their purpose was fairly hefty. And so you can find it on page 766 of the article. But their purpose was to increase the size of a response class during serial training. So training one response one after another would make DRA more durable without the use of resurgence, even when there were issues with procedural integrity. And they wanted to look at decreasing the percentage of total responding allocated toward the target response. They wanted to look at the decrease in the magnitude of the target response during resurgence when reinforcement was withheld, and evaluate whether the serial training program would produce reversion, primacy, or recency when reinforcement was withheld. And what they're talking about there is what alternative responses will resurge, right? Will it be the one that was just reinforced and now placed on extinction? Will it be the second one? Will it be the first one? So they're looking at the different alternate responses.
And Jackie, so like you said briefly, serial training in terms of one after another training, as opposed to FCT for like Lucky Charms, right?
Yeah. I would love FCT for Lucky Charms, but they actually look at both of those.
I was trying to get some of those Honey Smacks or Golden Crisp Pops, but they're out, I guess, in the stores. I don't know why. That's the item.
That's funny. It's important to note that this is translational research, right? So the responses that they're looking at are not actual problem behavior, and the alternative responses that they're using are not functional in any way, right? So there's a lot of switches, and one switch was the target response, and then all the other switches were alternative responses. But that's important to note because I was reading, taking notes, and then I was like, wait, where's the problem behavior? Without remembering that this is translational, right? So I have not found a study that's looked at this study with actual problem behavior. So that would be something that someone could do fairly easily for a thesis. But they had 3 participants, 32, 53, and 59-year-old women. All were diagnosed with an intellectual disability. All could speak in at least 1 to 2 word utterances and worked in a sheltered workshop. One of them worked part-time at a job with a job coach. And so they collected data on the response rate across 5 topographically different responses. And I wish that they had an appendix where I could see what these devices look like, because some of them I didn't know, like a toggle light switch. Yeah, a toggle light switch. So I guess that goes up and down. A rocker light switch, I'm assuming goes side to side. A slide light switch, which I imagine is like a cord switch. I'm assuming it's that. I'm just pulling down. And a personal alarm button. I think that's just a button, like on your alarm clock, I imagine. So one switch was designated as a target response, and then all the other responses were coded as alternative responses, A1, B1, B2, B3. They varied the target responses across the participants as well as the alternative responses. So not everyone got the toggle light switch as the target response. One thing to note was Andrea used 2 different types of switches because she did not reliably emit responses on some of the designated switches. They were the same type, but they looked a little different, I guess. A response was scored every time a participant picked up the device, functionally engaged with the device for the appropriate consequence. I think one of them said turning on the light and then putting the device down. They also scored whether reinforcers were delivered, and that was scored every time a high preferred item was given to the participant. And they did note, which I love when people note, that they used a preference assessment prior to the start of the study. IOA was good. One thing I loved about this is they were like, data collectors were suspended if they got below an 80% and then retrained. So if you got below 80%, you're out. You lost your job. You lost your IOA job until you could be trained and come on back again. So I like that they put that in there. The general session protocol was fairly simple. They had 2 components, a control component and a test component. The control component was where the target behavior was placed on extinction and reinforcement was delivered for a single alternative response. So this is like what Diana's study had talked about earlier. And so that makes sense. And the test condition was when the target behavior was placed on extinction, and then they reinforce each of the alternative responses in a sequential order, so one at a time.
I love when studies work to answer a question you didn't know you had. You're like, that is a great question.
Yeah.
I never thought about it, but what a great idea.
Yeah. They went a little crazy where they had each component done in a separate room to help with discrimination.
There's just like a hallway. Like, this hallway's closed. We're doing switch training. Not for any reason, just people pulling switches and flicking switches. Yeah, there could be resurgence. You don't want to be in this hallway.
Don't come down here. Yeah. So sessions were fairly short. I mean, Mary and Jenny had 5 minutes of each test and control with 2 minutes in between where they could walk around, go to their different room. Andrea, her session was decreased to 3 minutes because she frequently left the room. I love that. She was like, I'm out. You know what? This is boring. I don't want to play with my switches anymore. So they looked at her sessions before she had left, and it was around 3 minutes. So they had kept hers at 3 minutes. So she wouldn't leave. So they had 3 phases, similar to what you guys talked about. During the reinforcement phase, a single device was placed on the table, and the experimenter said, when you do this, you can have your preferred item. If they did the switch, then they received their item on a FR1 schedule. If they didn't do anything after 30 seconds, they were prompted to make a response and then receive the reinforcement. So they would stay in this phase for 10 additional sessions after independence was shown. That's a lot of sessions.
Yeah. And you're just engaging with the same
switch
thing for 5 minutes like that. Ugh.
That's a lot. But they were sure that it was occurring then, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yep. And then during the elimination phase, which is the second phase, target behavior was placed on extinction, and then there was reinforcement of alternative behavior was present, right? So the same as the reinforcement phase, so that different device. So in the control component, there was just one response that they could emit on a device, and in the test condition, they taught the 3 separate alternative responses in sequential order, in different order for each participant. Here again, they had to do 5 additional sessions before moving to the next response of independence while still placing the target behavior on extinction. And if the devices were trained, they were never removed, right? So for that control condition, that alternative response was always there. And for the sequential training, if one of the behaviors one of the behaviors was reinforced, that device stayed and the new device came, while all the other alternative responses were placed on extinction, along with the target behavior.
Because with extinction, the response can still occur.
Right.
It may not be met with reinforcement, but if they'd remove the switches, then the response could not occur.
Yeah. So they thought they were thinking. And then the final phase was resurgence phase, where all the responses were placed on extinction. So again, they said in the control or only the target device and the alternative device were there, and the test all were there. They ran 5 sessions for Mary and Jenny. They ran 14 sessions for Andrea because they didn't see a meaningful decrease during extinction in the most recently reinforced response. So they wanted to see what would happen after a little bit more. And there are a lot of figures. So many figures. There are 2 tables and 9 figures.
Oh.
Yep. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the results, but they did their dirty work. They answered all of the questions that they sought to ask, and they show the data to prove it. When Jerry Maguire said, "Show me the data," I don't think he said that, but when he did, Lambert and colleagues were like, and threw all of the paper at them. That's what happened. So table 1 looked at the amount of reinforcer delivery across the participants and conditions. And what I took away from that table was that there was fairly similar reinforcer rates during test and control for each participant and across responses. So I think what they aimed to do there was just show that there wasn't more reinforcers in one or the other, that they were very similar. Figure 1 shows all 3 participants across all phases. The left side of the graph is the control condition, and the right side of the graph is the test condition. And so basically what I saw from this graph is that you can see the greatest resurgence across test and control conditions, but you can see resurgence across all of those, but you can see more immediate resurgence of problem behavior in those test conditions than in the control condition for 2 out of 3 participants. And that resurgence, I meant you could see more problem behavior in the control condition via the test condition. Sorry, I said that backwards. And so figure 2 just looked at the cumulative number of responses during test and control. And what they noticed here is that the white So it's a bar graph and they're stacked. So white is the alternative response and black is the target response. And they saw fewer target responses occurred in the test condition than in the control condition. So that's kind of awesome. And 2 out of 3 participants have the most responses in the test condition, but it wasn't the target response, meaning that they were responding, but they were using their alternative responses instead of engaging in the target response to gain access to the reinforcement potentially, right? So that's kind of neat. Figure 3 through 8 just shows second by second analysis, right? Who did that? That's a lot of data.
Joe.
I know.
I don't know. In terms of translational research, it's just a matter of, it's not necessarily directly applicable. We got to put everything in there. Otherwise, this feels like a vanity project potentially.
I think this one answers the question of when were those responses emitted during resurgence. And they were looking to see in what order they happened, right? So would it automatically go right back to the target behavior in the control condition? And that answer was yes, right? And the test conditions, in what order did you see those alternative responses come about? And for 2 of the 3 sub-participants, Jenny and Andrea, you did see that recency in reverse order, so that the most recently reinforced and then extinguished alternative behavior or alternative response researched first. So that's really what they're looking at there. They were looking to see in what order would that occur, because no one has really looked at that before. And then figure 9 shows the percentage of recovering responses. And during the test, the target response shows the least amount of resurgence, which is awesome. That's what you would want, right? And 2 participants showed the largest amount of responses to most recently reinforced and extinguished response, which is also ultimately what would you want clinically, right? Yeah. Because then those alternative responses are going to be occurring instead of the target behavior. So I think some takeaways from both of those articles is that it actually might be beneficial to teach multiple alternative responses. So if one specific alternative behavior is placed on extinction, it may be more likely that another behavior may be emitted instead of that problem behavior. And this is how you can inoculate against resurgence. This could also be a way to program in for treatment integrity errors, so that if there are a wide variety of people implementing this DRA or implementing your FCT, that it's more likely that an alternative behavior will be met with reinforcement at some point, right? And that problem behavior. They suggest that they should program in a behavior that will very likely exert strong stimulus control. And they said this could be the last resort for that problem behavior in the case of wanting the game. And I was thinking about a tea at that point. Like I could be like, hey, I could really like a tea. Nothing. Met with extinction. Hey, could you get me a tea? I want my tea now. Right? Like they're like, provide alters. But ultimately what they did say was like a kind of like, they were like laughing as they wrote it. I imagine they're like, but that one will probably be the one they use first. Right? Because it exerts the strongest stimulus control. They recommend that you could teach appropriate behaviors without extinction, because sometimes you might need to. And this is one way that you can mitigate those effects of resurgence. You could also teach behavior simultaneously, so you wouldn't have to necessarily do the serial training that Lambert and colleagues did. And this could be important to consider alternative responses during schedule thinning procedures, so that it might mitigate the effects of resurgence. And I think the biggest takeaway point I got from these 2 articles is that it's important to bring this up as a possibility to all the relevant stakeholders when using DRA and to plan for it, right? So if you're like, okay, resurgence can be possible, we should tell people that it is potential that you might see this problem behavior occur again because of something, right? Because of a schedule thinning, because of a missed opportunity to engage in the reinforcement of this FCR or whatnot. And if we see that problem behavior, continue to not reinforce it, right? And it will go away, but here's why. And we know that it's going to happen, so we're not surprised, and we shouldn't throw everything out, or like everyone used to say in my undergraduate, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So yeah, I think that's really what I got from these 2, is that resurgence is something that we need to think about as clinicians, even though it's a scary term sometimes, right? Because like the definition is like long, and there's multiple first and seconds and extinguished and behaviors, but it's something that we should be planning for in the event that it's probably going to happen.
Well, that seems like a good cue to move into dissemination stations. We can kind of sum up everything that we've been discussing. Oh, it's like a digital underground. Ew. All right. So dissemination station, let's talk kind of a quick summary. So, I mean, I guess if you have to take home something, it's that resurgence isn't too scary, that if all you remember is, wow, old behavior can come back, even though it's still on extinction when I'm doing treatments for, alternative behavior. Okay, great. That's not super precise. You could do better, I know, but, these are tough times. You're stressed out, I'm sure. So if that's all you remember, that's a great start. And then you have some articles to go back to when you have some time. Excellent.
Zombie apocalypse.
Yeah. So, but the bigger issue, I think, going forward is like, how do we use this in our treatment planning? Like you said, Jackie, it's not like there's an exhaustive body of research that you're going to be able to go back to. There are models, there's basic research, we've got some translational research. So it's more generally thinking about using the principles we learned from that research as part of our planning. There's no, if you do this, don't worry about resurgence, or if you do this, you're going to see worse resurgence. I mean, that one a little bit more so than the former. But what would be kind of the starter places that you would recommend, practitioners look at in terms of resurgence and the direct impact to practice? Would it be that including it in the discussion of, possible, not exactly harm, but, possible cons of the treatment that you're proposing? Would it be in planning, maybe trying some of that, not necessarily serial training, but that maybe multiple exemplars in your FCT? What
I like that.
Yeah, I think that would be a definite, like training multiple responses is always a good thing, right? And that's how typical child development happens, right? Like your kid doesn't always say, "Excuse me, mommy and daddy, I would love milk, please." And you're like, "Oh, here you go," right? It's usually like, "Wow, my cup is empty," right? There's like so many ways that in typical child development, there's access to a certain thing. So I think that we should be, cognizant of that and be training multiple ways to get something that also promotes self-advocacy skills for our students, right? Or the people that we're serving, so that they, have a repertoire to get those things. When one response doesn't work, there should be other responses to gain access to that same reinforcer. I also think that we forget to talk about resurgence, right? That's one thing that I know a lot of clinicians don't have in their forefront of their risk benefits worksheets that they're doing according to the BACB guidelines, right? We should all be doing those. I think resurgence is something we talk about in class. You talk about it in your graduate program, but then sometimes it gets put on the shelf because it's more of a basic related, topic. And I think that it shouldn't be. I don't think we should be putting it on the shelf, waiting for it to get dusty and ruining all of our best laid plans. Resurgence.
I think that this is a good topic too, to think about how are we going to explain this to parents, right? And this is one of those more technical sides of behavior analysis where parents, unless they really are interested, don't need to know the concept of resurgence. So I think that this is a good one to think about. Well, I as a behavior analyst want to learn all the nitty gritty of this, and I'm going to go back and read the 30-page Greer article and Shahan and just get down into it, right? If you're into that, go for it. But I think that if you then go to a family and say, "I'm going to do extinction and then resurgence could happen, and let me explain to you all about what resurgence is," that could be kind of scary and off-putting. So I think thinking about the balance of what I as a behavioral scientist should know and how do I best interpret that for a family are two different things. So for a family, you might want to just say, if we're going to do extinction, we got to do it right. We could see a lot of behavior happen initially, but it will get better. But if in the long run, you see little bits of that behavior popping up, you need to just stay the course, right? Because it could be spontaneous recovery or it could be resurgence, and reminding them how important it is to reinforce those FCRs, for example, and not give attention to that problem behavior, even if it pops up a month later, is the way that we could present this in hopefully a comforting way to a family without really just getting in the weeds, losing them.
I'm imagining myself as a parent on the other end of that conversation. I totally would do glossy dead eyes at that moment. You're like, resurgence, and
that sounds scary. I don't like your treatment anymore.
Yeah.
No, thank
Nobody
you.
wants that.
Sounds like an army is coming to attack me. I don't want that. No. And to some extent, I don't want to dismiss the impact that resurgence could have. Some of it is just a matter of, as long as you're aware it can happen, and it could, and you just stay the course, because it's not a matter of your procedure failed. What did you do wrong? It's no. These things happen. then you ride it out. Sort of like we tell people with Extinction Burst. I know a lot of professionals from lots of walks, I feel, have heard the term Extinction Burst. Somehow that made it into the lexicon, and everyone understands that things are going to get better before they get worse. That phrase is all over the place.
Other way around.
Things are going to get worse before they get better. Sorry.
Hopefully.
Well, they might also get better before they get worse too. You don't know. You go either way. The same with resurgence stuff. Like, just because things are going well now, they might get bad a little bit, but stay the course and go back to being good again. I swear. It's just something to be aware of. And then for, the practitioners, we can talk about resurgence. We can be more precise. We can look like, why exactly is this happening? How can I prevent this from happening? But even if all you know is it could happen, here's when you would see it happen. Here's what you would see if you kind of keep your course. Just don't get scared that where did this like voodoo target behavior has appeared out of nowhere. Oh my goodness, what happened? Did I mess up? Did someone summon this?
Well, maybe you did though, right? So that's also an indicator that somebody maybe have messed up, and then you go back and look to see, okay, do we need more training? Are they accidentally not reinforcing that target behavior that we want, that appropriate target behavior that we want? Or did somebody think, oh, we're good, and then the schedule too fast, right? So if resurgence appears, we may know it's going to happen because we're requiring a more complex skill, which, right? That it's going to come back for a tiny bit. Or we're like, oh, we're what we want to be. And then problem behavior starts popping up. That's a clue to us that it's possible that someone isn't doing what they need to be doing, and then more training is necessary.
Yeah. I'd really love to see the applied study kind of from I think that was the Lambert with what if you just taught hey, I asked for the cookie by saying I want cookie. And then after a while of doing that, put I want cookie on extinction, and then teach them that they should say I love cookie, please give me a cookie, and just keep rotating through the multiple exemplars, and then do the, okay, no, none of them work now, and see, do the kids just cycle through that? Do you get more of that? Because it wasn't 100% in the Lambert study, but do you see some of that pattern there? How does it compare to, say, I'm going to teach a child, you could do any of these 5 will work. Does it work better when you do that versus I'm going to teach one, then I'm going to teach a second, then I'm going to teach a third, then I'm going to teach a fourth, then I'm going to see what happens when I take them all away, and then I'll, go back to what I would expect.
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, that would be a cool thesis idea.
There you go.
Really easy to do. Super applicable. Thesis!
I know. I feel like we've been a fount of thesis ideas over these many episodes. So I wonder if anyone's ever taken any of the random thoughts we had at the end of an episode and done a thesis. Please make sure you email us and tell us this. We would be very excited to promote that idea and curious about the results.
Yeah, or write them down, because I always am like, what were those ideas that I had?
I know. Well, we can always listen to our own recordings, but I think we listen to each other's voices just enough as is, right?
Yeah.
Just enough.
Just enough. All right. Well, I think that brings us that sounds like a good segue to the end of the episode. So thank you, Jackie and Diana, for talking so much about resurgence, this fascinating topic. I'm not being facetious. I really, really enjoyed learning more about resurgence this week. And I did extra reading. I did extra credit, teacher. I did it.
Gold stars.
So proud of you.
I know. I've got all these great graphs of Resurgence's choice on my wall now. I'm so excited about the topic. Before we wrap up the show, I want to make sure to give you all that second secret code word. It is mulberry. 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 Like a street or berry. Maybe it's a berry. I think it's not, though. Is it a real berry?
Yes.
Anyone know? It is?
Yeah, because you can go all around the mulberry bush. But I was really thinking, we've been taking a lot of walks in the neighborhood lately, and I like that book to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street.
Oh. What did he see? Like a murder?
Like a band.
Oh.
An elephant, maybe.
Dr. Seuss's, I think I saw it on Mulberry Street, reimagined these dark times. Mulberry. All right. And with that brings us to the end of another episode of ABA Inside Track. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please, if you did, subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or, wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can also find these posted on social media, wherever, as on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can also find these on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. And of course, on the main website itself, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find the episode and links to the articles as well. If you would like to, we would love to hear from you. If you have topic ideas, thoughts about the episodes, or just have something you want to say, please write to us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Big thanks to the people who help us with the production of this. So Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Daniel Thabit from the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. Well, with all that and all those thanks gone away, let's take it to the end. We'll see you all next week for another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.